Research continues for definitive proof of the pandemic's origins, with some interesting work released last week. One researcher noted that not only were raccoon dogs sold at Huanan Market in Wuhan, and that SARS had been found in raccoon dogs in previous outbreaks, but also that most early symptomatic cases were linked specifically to the section of the Wuhan market where the raccoon dogs were caged. And that is one of those raccoon dogs right there. Oh, he's so cute. The researcher also examined the earliest known cases and found 10 of the local hospital's 19 earliest COVID cases were in fact linked to Huanan markets. And he put out this map of Wuhan. These are the relevant markets. These are the 2 campuses for the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And these are the known addresses of COVID cases in December 2019. That doesn't prove anything, but they certainly do seem to be congregating around those markets, don't they? Finally, what was until now thought to be the earliest COVID-19 case, a man who had no connection to Huanan Market at all, but reportedly had COVID on December 8, he now appears to have gone to hospital with a dental issue. And then he caught COVID around the 16th of December, meaning the earliest known case was actually a seafood vendor at, you guessed it, the Huanan Market on the 11th of December. Well, that is interesting. Interesting enough to speak to the researcher himself. His name is Dr. Michael Warraby, and he's head of the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Arizona. Professor, welcome to Planet America.
Good to be here, thanks.
They know that 10 of the 19 earliest victims of COVID were linked to Huanan Market. But how do we know that those 19 were amongst the earliest victims? How do we know that we didn't just miss a whole bunch of victims that were right near the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Yeah, so that's a fair question, and it's the kind of question that I went into this study trying to work out. And what I did was sort of started at the outer layer of the onion with scientific studies that had been published on early cases, and concerned that there might have been biases that affected those numbers. Eventually went to news reports and firsthand accounts from the doctors in Wuhan who first noticed the outbreak. And there it becomes very clear. So at one hospital in particular, Xinhua Hospital, which is near Huanan Market, it was a doctor named Zhang Jixian who noticed on December 27th that an elderly couple both had what we call these ground glass opacities, these lesions of pneumonia that show up in a CT scan. And those were very different than anything she'd seen in viral pneumonia cases leading up to that time point. And from that point on, she was looking hard in her hospital to find other patients who had those lesions. And she found another one in the couple's son who was feeling healthy, but she strong-armed him into getting a CT scan. He had the same lesions. And then over the next 2 days, 4 more people appeared with the same unexplained pneumonia, and all 4 of them were linked to the market. So it's not the case that her hospital was full of 150 people with this unexplained pneumonia. There were 7, and 4 of them were linked to the market. And we see the same thing at multiple other hospitals. So I don't think that there's any reason to think that huge numbers of these cases were being missed. And in fact, there's very good reason to think that they weren't, because that happened later in January and it overwhelmed the hospitals. That wasn't happening in December.
Now, some have said that your most significant contribution to the debate is your discovery that the person who was thought to be the first known COVID victim may not have been the first known COVID victim because he may not have had COVID when he was actually checked into the hospital. What makes you think that?
Although that's interesting, I don't consider that the most important thing that I found here. I think the most important thing is just doing away with this idea that, hey, maybe there were an ocean of other cases not linked to the Huanan market that we just missed. To lay that to rest is really important because it raises the question, how on earth, of all the places in Wuhan that's the size of New York City, does your first big cluster end up being one of the 4 little locations that sell these raccoon dogs? Now, let's go to that December 8th case, so-called December 8th case, that had been put forward as the earliest case, someone who was not linked to the market and lived many kilometers away. He had, I think, been, a part of a lot of the thinking that, okay, maybe this didn't start at Huanan Market. And as you say, I was able to show that in all likelihood, on December 8th, he was actually suffering from a dental problem that was diagnosed and gave him a fever for a day. But he himself, in his own words, in a video interview, describes his COVID onset as happening with a fever that started on December 16th. And that puts him well after other early cases, including what is now the earliest on record, which is a woman who was a vendor at Huanan Market, and she probably got sick around December 10th.
What do you think realistically we can next do to investigate this question further, given the lack of apparent interest from China in assisting any inquiries?
Yeah, so a lot of energy is going into hand-wringing about China not giving all of the information that outsiders want. And I have even been involved in writing letters criticizing China for that lack of complete openness. But what I've realized doing this study is that the WHO report that a lot of the data that we do have on the early cases in December comes from actually is a tremendous resource. And there is a lot more information in that report that can be mined and integrated with other things that we know about in terms of epidemiological modeling, the genomic analysis of the sequences of the virus that have been sampled from early patients. And I do think that we may get to a point where we have pretty conclusive evidence of this virus's origin at that market. And in a way, we already have stronger evidence than we ever had for the first SARS that there was a link to wet markets. In SARS-1, we never had, 55 of the earliest 100 and some odd cases linked to a particular market. And the fact that we have that here just can't be ignored, and it really can't be easily explained away. It would be the coincidence of the century if the first person infected was infected elsewhere, but then didn't leave any evidence of infection anywhere in Wuhan, except for one of these places that sold the species that brought us SARS.
This is a weird question, but why do the origins of the virus actually matter? Why can't we just say, watch out for wet markets and watch out for potentially dangerous research if they could both be realistic potential causes of a pandemic?
Well, let's deal with the wet market idea, which we know is a realistic cause of pandemics. We actually don't know that a lab leak is realistic, and in all likelihood, it didn't cause this pandemic and has never caused any other pandemic. Now, there was a release of an influenza virus in 1977, but it was not a lab leak. It was actually an intentional use of what we call a live attenuated vaccine, a vaccine that was supposed to have a weakened form of the virus, but it was still alive and probably got out that way. And so what the question is, if the lab leak idea is wrong, and it almost certainly is, how much is it taking our eye off the ball of what actually happened? And that's the crucial question. And right now, we're not actually learning the lessons that we should have learned. And practically speaking, if the majority of the world thinks that this came from a lab leak, there's going to be a whole lot of action to limit the kind of lab work that can actually, in some cases, put us in a better position in defending ourselves against pandemics. And there's going to just not be a serious enough appraisal of how did this happen exactly, and what can we do to prevent cross-species transmission of pandemic viruses in places like Huanan Market.
Dr. Michael Warraby, thanks so much for visiting Planet America.
Thanks very much.